Long before white settlers arrived, the Oregon coast and their native tribes had an earlier Euro-American visit. A ship carrying Chinese porcelain and massive amounts of beeswax wrecked at the Nehalem Bay, scattering its cargo along the Nehalem sandspit and nearby beaches. Historical research makes it clear that the ship was a Spanish galleon, as the Spanish were the only ones who traded beeswax in significant quantities. The ship was part of the Manila Galleon trade route, a centuries-long network where Spanish ships connected the Philippines and Mexico, two of its claimed territories. For years, it was believed that the ship was the San Francisco Javier, which went missing in 1705.
It was most likely the San Francisco Javier. That was the ship we figured, okay, this is the most likely one.
However, after recent archaeological analysis, it was concluded that the wrecked ship was actually the Santo Cristo de Burgos, which was reported missing 8 years earlier in 1693. Geologist Kurt Peterson studied the shoreline and the placement of artifacts and determined that only a tsunami wave could have pushed them so far above sea level.
When we were doing that geology work, that our geologist from Portland State University, looking at all the information he had collected and the historic information, he said, your ship wrecked before the earthquake. And we were kind of like, it couldn't have wrecked before the earthquake. There's no ship missing before the earthquake.
When it became clear that the ship was not the San Francisco Javier, this research team had to do more digging. As research continued, it was discovered that the trusted galleon history book had gotten its information from what turned out to be a fictional book from the 1920s. Another piece of evidence appeared in the Spanish archives.
It was a letter written in 1699 from the governor of the governor of the Philippines to the governor of Mexico to pass on to the King of Spain, saying, Your Majesty, it's been 6 years. We have searched every coast, every island of the Western Pacific. The Viceroy in Mexico has searched the coast of North and South America from Peru up to Mexico. There is absolutely no sign of this ship. No one has ever survived. No wreckage has ever been found. So we figured that was more evidence that the story written in 1925 was fiction.
A previous incident had left the ship damaged, and it had had to return to port.
This particular galleon had trouble. It ran into a storm in 1692 and had to come back to port, which was a calamity for the Spanish colony in Manila, because all the goods didn't get to New Spain and get sold, and all the money didn't come back to Manila.
In these cases, the Spanish made investigations. Luckily for researchers today, this meant lots of extra records, including a full crew and passenger list and a full cargo list, which is unfortunately partially missing. The Santo Cristo de Burgos was headed to Acapulco, Mexico from the Philippines, planning to deliver beeswax candles to Catholic missions. However, the ship ended up nearly 3,000 miles north of her intended destination in what is now Northwest Oregon. The Manila trade was that of luxury goods.
Beautiful, gorgeous embroidered silks, often with silver and gold thread, beautiful embroidery with flowers, lacquered desks, inlaid lacquered desks, silk fans, silk and lace fans, ivory figurines.
Because the cargo list is mostly missing, we'll never know for sure all of what was on the Santo Cristo. However, we do know that the cargo included Chinese porcelain, a few tons of liquid mercury, and of course the loads of beeswax. Silks and spices were likely on board as well. Spanish coins have also been found on nearby beaches.
It's quite fascinating to think that a maravedi would be found on the shipwreck, but it would have been a small currency that would have been used on board, perhaps between the crew members gambling. The 1 real silver coin dating from that time period are found on different shipwrecks.
The natives would not have let the wrecked ship go to waste. While most of what arrived in Nehalem are long gone, we can still see evidence of how they used the new items.
Chinese silks are gone, within a few years of the wreck, if any survived at all. Silk and seawater don't mix very well. And if the native peoples had some barrels of silk, they would presumably have used the silk and cloth wears out, and so, we're done with that. Spices obviously also didn't last for very long. The key things that have lasted are the porcelains, or fragments thereof, and the beeswax.
Porcelain has been found carved into arrowheads or decoration, as were coins.
The thing is, if you've got something that is very pretty to wear, that's a status symbol.
Beeswax was mainly used for waterproofing of clothes and baskets and as an antiseptic on wounds. Remains of teakwood furniture and pieces of metal have also been found. When Euro-American trappers and later settlers arrived in the 1800s, they soon learned of the beeswax wreck from the natives. A journal entry from Private John Whitehouse of the Lewis and Clark expedition confirms that the natives were trading the beeswax. 7 years later, trapper Alexander Henry records the first written account of the wreck in 1813, writing of great quantities of beeswax that is still being dug out of the sand, and that the Clatsop often bring it to trade. Henry was the first to identify the ship was possibly Spanish, likely through his knowledge of the Manila trade and recognizing the markings IHS on the beeswax blocks, meaning they were destined for Catholic churches. Despite the well-documented native oral history of the wreck, white settlers raised questions about the beeswax. Some claimed that the beeswax was in fact not beeswax, but a type of naturally forming mineral wax. The claim was based solely on the belief that there was no way this massive quantity of the substance could have been carried on any ancient ship. There was such a conflict over the origin of the wax that in 1895, the United States Geological Survey sent a sample to geologist Dr. J.S. Diller, whose analysis concluded it was definitely beeswax. More recently, analysis has found the wings of bees inside the wax, from a species native to the Philippines. Beeswax and artifacts were not the only survivors of the wreck.
Yeah, so we are really certain there were survivors because the Indians said there were survivors. And what bolsters that, besides just the Indian stories, is there are families on the Oregon coast and the Oregon coastal tribes who also have histories of shipwreck survivors as being their ancestors, and they have the genetic trait for red hair.
Native history accounts that at least some of the crew survived, came ashore, and lived peacefully among the tribe for a time, until the sailors began to take married Clatsop women for themselves. The natives responded by attacking and killing the crew. Centuries later, as the region became more populated, white settlers couldn't help but notice that some of the Clatsop tribe were freckled, light-skinned, or red-headed. In the 1840s, early historian John Minto visited Chief Cullowhee and recorded meeting a native girl named Margaret, who he couldn't believe wasn't white. John Minto corroborates his story by mentioning a native man recorded by the Lewis and Clark party in 1806 with skin so pale it freckled and light hair. With no idea of his origins, they had simply assumed he was part white. Earlier, Alexander Henry also noticed a man who he described as having extraordinarily dark red hair, who is the supposed offspring of a ship that was wrecked within a few miles of the entrance of this river many years ago. Many more stories suggest that the sailors left descendants among the natives, including Soto, known as the Old Half-Bred Indian, who lived farther north and claimed to be the son of a Spaniard sailor. The Beeswax wreck was not the only pre-settler shipwreck along the Oregon coast. In journals, books, or interviews, most settlers relate one story involving a ship fight, buried treasure, a dark-skinned blacksmith, and beeswax flooding the shores.
That old game they used to call telephone, where I tell you something, you tell the next person something, that person tells the next person something, and it changes. That's essentially what happened, and mostly by the settlers, because the original Indian stories are very clear. There were two separate ships. The Beeswax wreck wrecked a long time ago, but the Neahkahnie treasure ship did not wreck. It sailed up to Neahkahnie Mountain, anchored, and a crew rowed ashore, buried something on Neahkahnie Mountain, rowed back to the ship, and sailed away. There were still Indians alive in the 1840s and 1850s who had seen that ship when they were little kids.
The last time there was a credible sighting of the Beeswax ship was in 1926. Today, the Maritime Archaeological Society has been on the hunt for the remains of the wreck, as well as recording and studying the artifacts found. They use underwater robots, radar, diving teams, magnetometers, and more. Sadly, no significant wreckage has yet been found. The Beeswax shipwreck broke the barrier between Oregon and the rest of the global trade network, impacting the material used in the day-to-day lives of Native Americans, changing their genetics as wreck survivors procreated with natives, and introducing foreign ideas that would prepare tribes for the settlement to come.
The fact that the story of the shipwreck and the survivors survived to be told to later settlers is an indication of how important it was.
It is incredibly fascinating to think about that somewhere among us, whether they are still in Oregon or not, but somewhere among us, there are people very possibly walking around with the DNA from this interaction.
This event had long-lasting effects and continues to be central to Oregon history, and it's only just being discovered. Special thanks to Scott Williams, Cameron LaFollette, and Robert Lewis Necht, and viewers like you. Thank you.